Well, here's the lighting for you. It's been a while since I've done anything in here. Oh, one of my windows aren't looking quite right on my laptop. Well, I don't think I shot too many videos on that in a while, have I? Shouldn't dilly-dally too much around here tonight, because my battery power is limited. All right. So if you're new to what I'm doing here, I basically take existing ideas, break them down into their existing ideas from pop culture, break them down to their constituent parts, reassemble them into new ideas inspired by the original works. And as a test run of some of these ideas, I did a set of at least 9 stories that we disassembled and reassembled into new works a couple months ago. And I recorded them as I do this now. And as I recorded them, I also wrote notes down on this laptop. And then about a month, maybe a month and a half ago, this laptop shredded its hard drive. So I lost all my notes. Now I can go back and watch the videos, but this seemed like a good opportunity to prove a point that I've made in the past, which is any 2 artists given the same material to work with will produce 2 different stories. So I could go back and review what I came up with before, but it seemed like this was a perfect opportunity to be both artist 1 and artist 2. So I'm taking the same ideas that I took before, disassembling them, and reassembling them into a story idea. But that story idea is likely to be in a vastly different form than the one I had before, despite the fact that we're starting from the same 9 story ideas. So the story idea I'm going to play with this time is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We were covering it a little bit last night, and I had a blast brainstorming in it. But I kid you not, it's one of those things when I do one of these episodes sometimes where like my brain is just barely, focused enough to be able to pull off some ideas. But as soon as I sit and I start talking about some of my ideas, I turn that camera off, and within a half an hour, I spend the next hour, 2, sometimes 4 to 5 hours just sitting there going, ooh, and then this, and start pulling apart things. And like once you kind of push your brain into the pattern of thinking creatively, if you catch just the right thread, it can keep you just going for a long while. And that's sort of what happened last night. So I don't even remember all of what I said last night, but we were talking about taking Buffy. We talked about how potentially you could do the reverse of everything in Buffy, where you have a young female valley girl kind of character whose life is interrupted when they discover they're the chosen one. Now, really, that's the whole core of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer setting, is you have an unlikely chosen one, chosen, reluctant to take the challenge, and then ultimately finding that they take it more seriously than we thought they did by the end. It's sort of like a redemption from vapid childishness to, in certain ways, it's also like a coming of age story. But it's a coming of age as a superhero kind of concept. And it is a superhero origin story. It just so happens that the concept you're fighting against is the supernatural vampire theme. So that's really, when I break down the Buffy, what that is. Now you can take that concept and just flip it over. Then you can get, instead of a young female valley girl, a very serious professional older man. And instead of vampires, aliens. Instead of, going the other direction, from supernatural to advanced technology and biology. So there's an aspect of that you can do. It's not really what I wanted to do. So I was playing around with the idea of taking a character who was unfit by the judgment of the rest of society, and even maybe by himself. And he only gets the job because nobody else stepped up and somebody had to. It's sort of like the accidental chosen one. And that's an okay idea. But I had this momentary, I think it was where we were finishing up yesterday when I jumped onto TV tropes and landed on some of the ideas that sort of started to percolate into something more. And part of that was, what if instead we do a story that it's the character who isn't the chosen one? They don't have their chosen one anymore. And it's the people who have to make up for that deficit. So not quite the sidekicks, but kind of. So I had this idea of making the setting one in which you have, I started with the idea of, okay, start with a chosen one and their watcher or handler, however you want to refer to it. And this chosen one is granted a special key, a device, a thing that enables them to be powerful. Now, the watcher or the handler trains them in the use of this device and how to harness the gifts that it enables them to have. But what if, as a legacy hero, as this tends to be a story of a legacy hero, you have somebody who's the next in line to be the champion and then becomes the champion. And then they have to find the next in line to start training them. If you have that concept, you also have the tendency of this order, this watchers or handlers be brought up, trained to train the next chosen one. So for me, I was starting to think, like, what if this isn't the story of the chosen one? What if this is a story of the people trained to choose and train the chosen one? So watchers and training. And I started to build this concept in my head of, okay, so you have this watcher in training, the one that's going to replace the chosen one and the watcher who trains her. So I had this idea of, like, well, what happens if the chosen one and her watcher both die? You're left with watchers in training without a chosen one, trying to figure out how they find their watcher or their chosen one and proceed from where they are. But they never finish their training. They're not complete watchers yet. And so I got to thinking, like, what if they're the ones that end up using the device to save the day, but they're not the chosen one? So they're always going to be like I don't want to say crappy, but a secondhand chosen one knockoff. So I got to thinking, like, all right, so you could have a watcher, but I felt like I still wanted to maybe pursue the angle of the disabled person who's saving the day despite the fact that they really shouldn't be able to. And they don't even think they're capable of doing it, but nobody else is able to do it. So they're their best shot. I like that idea. But I had the idea of it being like a teenage girl who's either using crutches or in a wheelchair of some kind. And I wonder, like, if she's missing her legs or something like that. I haven't quite decided on that yet, but if she has some training as a watcher, but she's not able to fulfill that role because she hasn't gotten far enough in the training yet, what if she was supposed to be the next watcher, but the situation that cost her her legs also cost her the prospect of being the next watcher? And so they stopped her training, and in the meantime tried to do some training with her younger brother, who's too young to have gotten enough training yet. So between the two of them, they have about the same amount of training, which is nowhere near enough to find and train their chosen one or to do anything useful. And so you have these two characters, and I thought, like, well, all right, what if we gave them a third character? Because the thing about Buffy was the TV series had Buffy with a group. They called them the Scooby Gang. There's a witch, a pretty regular guy, the Watcher, the Chosen One, and one or two other friends that got roped into the path at some point. And some of them spent the first chunk of the series not part of that group. But in the process of all the things they experienced, end up being dragged into it. So what if we had a character like that? A Cordelia. Who are some of the other ones? Oh, well, I mean, Willow's girlfriend was already sort of caught in some of that anyway. But you have certain characters who do get sort of pulled into this series of events that follow. So I got to thinking, like, what if you had somebody they were helping who gets pulled into the whole mess? And they act as the surrogate for the viewer, reader, whatever, because they have the world explained to them as an outsider. And they also call into question some of the standards and patterns of the world that they're called into in such a way that people go like, well, actually, I mean, I guess it's just done that way for tradition. But if that's not an option for us, maybe we can do something other than the tradition. So this trio of people, you have the disabled girl, the too young child brother, and the civilian drug into the middle of this. And they end up having to take up the role. So the way I sort of set it up in my brain was taking the idea of you have your chosen one, Auntie Chosen One, and her watcher. Her watcher is Uncle Watcher. Because the way I played this out in my head was originally what you had maybe in place was dad and mom, maybe both, maybe just one of them is a watcher. And they're driving home with the kids, baby in the carry-all or the car seat, and the older sister who's been getting a little bit of knowledge of what the watchers do, and then the car is blown off the road. Now you can leave that as a story to uncover at some point about who was responsible for that happening. But the parents are killed. The daughter loses her ability to walk, either through broken back or shearing her legs off in some fashion. And that puts the position of the uncle watcher to take them on. And because neither of them are old enough to be watchers of any training, he's the watcher. They have their chosen one that they have to tend to. And that's sort of like their situation. Like, the replacement watcher is their uncle. And the son, the young boy is too young, and the girl who is maybe starting to get early training is no longer a viable candidate because she cannot perform in the field duties that may be required of a watcher. So they're sort of sidelined. The son is sort of getting the early stages that she got, but he's still too early in the process. So if the watcher uncle and their chosen one get killed, then they're without a watcher and they're without a chosen one. And if the situation that they're killed in has them helping a civilian, and that civilian gets pulled into the mess, the thing that makes the chosen one, the device in this case, is something that the watchers could pick up and use, but we have to put a limit on it. So, like, the chosen one could use it pretty much indefinitely, because their chosen nature is one that they're sturdy enough to handle the strain of it. Whereas anybody else, they're unable to contain the concentration they need to keep it running, so it shuts down. So anybody trying to use it, you could have somebody in emergencies use the device for a short period of time, 5 to 10 minutes. Maybe even set it up as 2 minutes, and if they practice with it, they can get it longer, but they'll never really be able to indefinitely use this device. So that's what I'm thinking. That makes sense. And so you have in the situation where the watcher and the chosen one are killed, that these kids, the civilian, the young girl, and her little brother, end up having to potentially use the device to solve the situation that cost them their watcher and their chosen one, but barely make the situation stop. They don't fix it. So the villain gets away. Now, I want to continue the story of them essentially being a trio of not ready, not chosen ones, using the chosen one's device to try to stop the bad things while they try to figure out what they have to do next. Now, part of that is figuring out the rest of the world. And I as I sat there contemplating this, I didn't want the chosen one to be the only chosen one. So I sort of got this sense of, like, there are multiple chosen ones. They're regional. It's sort of like a Superman has his chunk of territory, Batman has his chunk of territory. They don't encroach on each other's territories. So it's sort of like a staking out your territory kind of situation. And if we're going to have multiple chosen ones, I also want there to be multiple watchers. The watchers are sort of clans. They're trained specifically for a particular chosen one. Because remember, it's a inherited position. It's something it's not from your family necessarily, but you're a legacy. It's passed on to you. You're chosen, legitimately chosen. But you're chosen by a particular thing, and the nature of each of the things that you're chosen by tends to have preferences. It leans in certain directions. So this is a totally, like, it departs heavily from what we did yesterday, but it still uses some of what we came up with by the end of yesterday, with the idea that there is a disabled character filling the role that they're not really qualified to play. But in this case, it's a trio of people. It's the sister who's disabled. the younger brother who's too young, and the civilian that plays the surrogate for the reader or the watcher, so that we can get the sense that we are learning with them about the situation. Now, with a uncle watcher killed, they're sort of left as orphans, which is a tricky scenario to put them in. And with the chosen one gone, they're chosen one. Like I said, this is based off of the rough idea of doing regional chosen ones. And their chosen one is gone. There's theoretically a potential replacement for that chosen one, but they have to figure out how to find them. And because their device and their clan of chosen ones is distinctive from other clans and chosen ones, nobody else can tell them what the right path is. You might be able to learn from a few others, and they may seek them out. They may seek out another chosen one and another watcher at certain points. And that could be a good time to explore opportunities like the poorly chosen one, somebody who's an Anakin Skywalker, a chosen one, but he's an absolute jerk, and he's power hungry, and he's abusive. You could have other quirky approaches to the chosen one come into play. And meanwhile, you can also have that conflict of the Watchers as an organization sort of being mafia-like, where the sense that this particular group, they no longer have an intact functional clan, so one of their groups may try to move in and take over the territory. And so you can play some of that politics and personality game with this idea. But ultimately, what I want to happen is to have these three people, these three kids, just sort of making it up as they go along, trying to figure out what they need to do to get things back on track, find their chosen one. But in the meantime, the world still needs protecting. Their little chunk of the world still needs to be protected from the villain and the villain's associates. And so in that scenario, you kind of have to, improvise. And so non-chosen ones are going to be wielding the device that makes the chosen one. But there's a time limit on it because they're not able to hold on to that power long enough. So I'm thinking of it sort of along the lines of almost like a Thor's hammer, but I kind of want it to be different for everybody who uses it. So part of the appeal of that to me is with the civilian, the little brother, and the disabled sister, each one of them, when they get a hold of the device grants them certain capabilities that are different for each of them. It's not Thor's hammer, where if Jane wields Thor's hammer, she becomes Lady Thor, or however you want to refer to her. And when Odin's son wields it, he's the mighty Thor. But if Loki wields it, he's Thor Loki, or however you want to do that. But it's not the same powers wielded by different people. It's a little bit more like what's a good example? What's an example of people who step up, and when they each get a handle on a thing, it gives them their own unique spin on it? I can't think of a good hero that's a good part of that. I mean, there was a story I read years ago, an online piece of fiction where people became immortal, and they had the ability to summon magical weapons to defend them, and each person had their own weapon. So in a sense, it's very it's sort of like a Jedi with their lightsaber, and some of them with their specific talents. So each Jedi makes their own weapon. So maybe it's a gun, or maybe it's a cross hilt one, or each one has a kind of a flavor that's distinctly theirs in what they do. And so I feel like the device that we end up with for the character that is the chosen one can manifest differently for the wielder. And different chosen one would have different devices that behave differently. And their legacies of these things, they have a tendency to follow after each other, but not always the same. So somebody might get a sword. For that person, it's a rapier, but for the person before them, it was a claymore. And then for the person after them, it's more of a long sword or a sword, but it's pretty much always a sword. And then for somebody else, where their thing is almost always a hammer, you can have different types of hammers and different styles of use. And my connection is unstable. Of course it's unstable. Please wait while we try to reconnect. So 2647. I'll be interested to see if we lose too much of this tonight. I hate this crap. But at any rate, the idea of the device behaving differently for each person, or each chosen one, helps it also tell the story of these three kids who are not chosen ones, potentially getting a different use off of it. And because they're not chosen ones, their ability to maintain it is different. Okay, so hopefully we don't lose signal. I'll be curious to look at it tonight and then again tomorrow to see if we lose like 3 to 5 minutes of video content. It's happened before. I think it is right now. It's not plugged. The computer's not plugged in. I'm using my laptop through Wi-Fi for it, which is some of what was a problem before. I imagine once I hook all this back up to the other computer, it's probably going to give me similar troubles again. But it is what it is. We'll make do with what we have to deal with. But anyway, so we have the chosen ones with different devices. And then the non-chosen ones, not quite chosen ones, filling the shoes of a chosen one. And because they don't have the fine control or the link to the device, they sort of wield it differently. It behaves drastically differently than it used to. And I kind of maybe tag teaming. You have these three kids, and they, maybe fight the big bad, and as they're in the middle of that fight, one of them bolts around a corner, ducks into a hiding place while tossing the device to the next one, who lights it up and turns it on and becomes a secondary temporary chosen one for a little bit of time, and maybe has to pass that on at a certain point. And they just tag team it back and forth for a little bit. That to me sounds like a very interesting story. It's a story of the sidekicks trying to do the best that they can until they can find a replacement hero. And instead of finding the replacement hero, the whole story is really telling the fact that they are as good as any hero. They just don't realize it. They're heroes without being the chosen one hero. And so it's an opportunity to really kind of play with that character design and theme a bit. And So I started to play around with the build on this idea, and I was looking at ways to frame the story. Again, you're being a dark computer. So Chosen One wielding maybe a symbiote-like device, maybe a Thor's hammer device, maybe a witchblade device. Something in that genre, something in that wheelhouse. So having that Thor's hammer, symbiote, witchblade kind of device that they can use and play with. Well, play with. But I also have to figure out who my villains are going to be. And now there's a classic trope that's going to have to be included at some point, where using their Chosen One's device to do dark things. That's definitely a possibility of part of the story. But the other thing is, who are they fighting? Why is there a need for a Chosen One? And so I started to play around with that a little bit. So I have the characters, the device, the Watchers, the Chosen Ones, the sort of how the things work fairly well worked out. The trio of main characters are like the civilian, the surrogate for us, the not old enough and not fit enough for the job. And they're not even good enough to be Watchers yet. So they're making it up as they're going on. There's a time limit to the device they can use. There are multiple regional Chosen Ones that they can try to network with and find the politics and not best heroes. Having the villainous Watcher somewhere in that sequence of events. But I was really trying to figure out, who can my villains be? And I do want it to be some supernatural element, I guess, for this one. I feel that's the best fit. The supernatural element is important because we're dealing with a device that changes shape and can be partnered with the Chosen One. And yet you have to have sort of like a outsider group that they're protecting people against. But I think the thing I liked a lot about the Buffy TV series and its genre of others, like Angel, I think was another one. I don't know if there was another one in that same set. The thing I liked about that was that you had human characters who were helping the Chosen One. And you had people who got enwrapped in the hocus pocus. You had ordinary people that got involved in it. Now, some of those ordinary people picked up a book and became a witch. Some of those people became infected by a vampire and turned. Some of those people were monsters, but they were just different than people, living sort of secret lives of a double nature. They try to blend in with people on a regular daily basis, or at least live in the shadows and the environment they live in as part of the community. And they're not evil. And so there's some of that I really kind of like. The idea that there's a sort of hidden population that are not evil, and that there has to be a go-between to help that society coexist. So we had Oz was a werewolf, I think. You had Xander's girlfriend was a former demon. And you had Cordelia at various times, I think, developed abilities. Willow became a witch. There was a whole key thing with Buffy's non-existent sister that came into existence. Spike and Angel were vampires that turned to the side of good. So you had these sort of characters that were pulled over to the side of good. And they were part of the mysterious background. I think I did see a little bit of the TV series Grimm. Yeah, I do think that there's a certain element of being able to bring that mysterious, that spirit-filled world into the gameplay. Not necessarily as a game, because you could do this as a role-playing game. And I do have a copy of the old Buffy the Vampire Slayer role-playing game, and I got a PDF copy of that game somewhere. And I could run a tabletop game where we play in that kind of setting, but I rewrite a lot of it to fit this story that I'm doing right now. But having a world that's not just like the bad guy of the week is some monster that you drop from another world into ours. And so having that kind of ability for people to become enmeshed in it, to be turned into creatures, and to have a living population living in the undergrowth of your city. I mean, an equivalent would be like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Like they live down there, and there are other mutants that live there. You might be able to do something like that. But those types of situations don't suit a chosen one situation as well. Chosen one is almost always a prophecy or some sort of mysticism. So it's almost always the purview of fantasy or horror for there to be. Hello there. Um, it's always the province of fantasy for the most part. Now, there's a little wiggle room. You can have. I can think of two roughly sci-fi series that have a chosen one. You have the obvious one, Star Wars. It is sort of like a science fantasy rather than a science fiction. So having that chosen one, I don't think that honestly Star Wars was overly needing that chosen one, but it is structured on the monomyth. So it is a mythic, it's a fairy tale, it's a legend, it's a fantasy to a certain degree on that score. The other one I can think of that does that same thing is Chronicles of Riddick, where he, in Pitch Black, we don't get a sense of fully who he is. In Chronicles of Riddick, we get more sense of he's a destined hero. And I think they try to subvert that in the third one, and it sort of falls apart. I haven't seen the third one all the way through yet, so I can't say for sure how they handle that part of it, but it feels like they clumsily just dropped the ball on that. I do hear that the original creators had another way they were going with that. I'm kind of curious to see that, if they ever do anything with it. But with that in mind, science fiction, technology, aliens, and biological mutants are all tend to not be well suited to this chosen one setting. You can do it. You can make it happen. But I feel like for where this was leading me as a story concepts, I kind of like just stepping back into the role of doing a urban fantasy kind of. And so the things I sort of refer back to are things like Hellboy, and I mean there are a few others out there, but what I really like was like looking at some of the things of having the Cthulhu mythos, Stephen King's It, having dark fairies, like Hellboy 2 had fairies and monsters, having gravelings like in Dead Like Me, and gremlins, they're similar. And having the dark fae and the mysterious stuff going in the background, and maybe even touching in a little bit on something like Pan's Labyrinth, and having a little bit of that sense of like there are things in the background that go on that are not part of what we're familiar with. I do believe in Chronicles of Riddick. Uh, there was a statement somewhere by one of the mystic. I think it was Dame Judi Dench, who played a wind mystic or something, said that there was a prophecy of the last Furion, and he was to be strangled and left in a trash can as a baby. And it turns out that he was the prophesied last Furion who would use his people's destined abilities to overthrow a monster who it was said could only be overthrown by a Furion. And so he wiped out the entire Furion population. And that's why. And so it's just sort of like, it's the, brought to the edge of death, last of your kind, prophesied to overthrow the tyrant role that Riddick played. And so there is that sort of sense in that. And so it's brought up in the second movie. It's not part of the first one, and I don't know if they even go back to talking about it in the third one. So there is that sort of, he's the prophesied overthrower of the tyrant, which is a classic mythic structure. They play with it a little bit, but it does feel that way to me. But what I was looking at when I was looking at like the Hellboy idea of the chosen one, the one who's supposed to bring about the apocalypse, but he's been converted to the side of good. So he's the wrong chosen one for the side that he was born to. But looking at some of those ideas, it does offer the opportunity of those things that go bump in the night in the background going on. And you can do the same thing with a little bit of Pan's Labyrinth and some of the Cthulhu mythos, where people get enmeshed in doing the bidding of elder gods that cause corruption. And there's a little trick there, is the idea of the elder gods calling forth things, people to serve them on the world and cause problems. So in the idea of the Fae and the people who have learned magic or gone mad and learned alchemy and can do weird things on the world, that gives you an environment for Willow-like witches and werewolves and monsters and those types of characters to be actors in this story. It gives you a city beneath the city, where things that we don't know go on. And so it gives you a ripe playground and areas of, well, you can't blame every non-human for the monstrous non-humans. But it's decidedly a lot of non-humans who are going monster and you have to protect the world from. So there's a little bit of like, do I, don't I? Grimm does something similar. I do believe the Grimm TV series, I've only seen a little bit of it. But he's defending the world against rogue fairy tale creatures or something like that. But he's not if I remember correctly, he doesn't kill. He doesn't see himself as the hunter who hunts down all the fairy tale creatures. He kind of makes deals with them, whereas others hunt them. And so there's room for that sort of thing in the setting. That's very similar to what I'm playing with. But if we're going to go in the direction of having the Cthulhu mythos and Fae creatures interacting, you have room for the device that makes a chosen one being something they bond with, a symbiote or a parasite. And what if, and this is where I went a little weird, I said, what if we took the idea of Stargate SG-1 And we took the idea of like the symbiotes from Stargate SG-1 and the Goa'uld. They have their dark purpose of domination, enslavement, and tyranny over all the life forms in the galaxy. And they're sort of stuck in other realms, and they can sometimes bring through and convert people to be their soldiers. That sounds to me like the perfect recipe. You have these elder gods, the Cthulhu mythos creatures, who are gods, but they are also able to convert people of either the mythic Fey races or any of those other ones that we mentioned to be their Jaffa by giving them a parasite, a thing that bonds to them and grants them abilities to serve them. And those devices are sort of like mystical tools. But in the Stargate SG-1 mythology, part of the group of Goa'uld rebelled. There was one, the rebel goddess, who founded the Tok'ra. And she, all her children, all her creations, all the symbiotes she created to enable the Tok'ra to populate, they can be the equivalent of the tools that the Chosen One ends up with. So I'm thinking along the lines of a Witchblade or the Venom symbiote that is sort of like a proto connection, a Borg infection from the Cthulhu other gods. And it's something that they can give to their servants to serve them. But the one that rebelled against them created the Chosen One's tools. And those Chosen One tools are like the Venom symbiote, like the Witchblade, and can take different forms and applications depending on who's wielding it. Uh-oh, laptop's running low on battery, so I'm probably going to disappear real soon. Hang on. I need to carry this all back, so I should probably call it here for tonight. It's going to drop my signal. Oh, God, I need to save this file. Save. Yep. No, come on. Oh, come on. I need to be able to save this. I'm not going to be able to save this, am I? Chosen One. And yeah, battery is super low. I'm about to lose everything. And come on. Okay, so I just saved all of my documents so far. I should be pretty good. So if it kicks me off, it's going to disappear. All right. Catch you later, guys. Man, that's the battery for you. It had like 10 minutes of power and then it's gone. Okay, so